Well, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, even it's 12:30. And welcome to another Exeter Science Park webinar. I'm pleased to be able to welcome Ciara Eastell to our webinar today. Ciara's got a really interesting background. She's a professor of practice at the Exeter Centre for Leadership, which is part of the university's business school. She's an independent consultant and coach, where she focuses on change management and leadership development. So there's an awful lot of change at the moment knocking around. And she was previously Chief Exec of Libraries Unlimited, which is the charity that runs libraries across Devon and Torbay. And I think you demerged it, didn't you, at the time? So is that about right? Demerged?
We brought them to, yes, we came out of the local authority in Devon County Council and then set up as an independent. And then after that, about a year after that, set up with Torbay Libraries as well. So yeah, great times.
Yeah, a pretty complex change itself. So I'm going to hand over to Ciara and let her talk about leading after lockdown. I think it's one of the really important parts of what we all have to do to take our world forward. So over to you. I shall come back on in 15 or 20 minutes. See you in a moment.
Great.
Enjoy.
Thanks, Sally. Brilliant, thank you. So thanks, Sally, for inviting me to this session where, as you say, I'll be talking about leading after lockdown and how some of our recent experiences of leading through the pandemic could shape the way we lead our organisations in the future. And my observations really are based from seeing and talking to a number of chief execs and senior leaders within businesses and organisations across our region in recent weeks. I've also been participating in some future of work sessions that my colleague at the business school, Professor Ilka Inchalogo, has been running with local authority and local enterprise partnership colleagues across the Southwest. So I've talked to head teachers, I've talked to senior NHS staff, to leaders of local businesses, to senior police personnel, to leaders of our community and voluntary sector, and to chief execs of our local councils. And I've spoken to them at different times through the lockdown. So for some of them, I spoke to them in the early weeks of lockdown when they were still very much sort of adrenaline-fueled days of trying to move activities online and support staff in their first few weeks working from home. I've talked to chief execs about 8 weeks in, just as they were beginning to think about how they plan for the future, both the immediate future of reopening businesses and buildings, but also thinking about the longer term planning environment for our organisations in a very different world. And more recently, I've talked to chief execs as they begin to reopen their schools, their museums, their libraries, their businesses, and dealing with teams that I think are often quite tired now after sustaining energy levels for so long. So as we all know, it's been a time of huge change, and I have to say such impressive leadership within our region to see people just get on with it. As one of our chief execs said to me recently, there's been no rule book. People have just got on and done it. They've put aside organisational barriers that so often get in the way of good partnership working, and they've just done what's needed. But I think now, sort of 14 weeks or whatever it is in, things are shifting. And I just want to highlight some of the longer term shifts that I think are beginning to emerge. I think for me, this is a work in progress, and I'm very happy to hear from people if you've got additional ideas or insights that you'd like to share. And at the business school, we're really keen to hear from local organisations and businesses as you go through this change. So there are 4 themes that I want to just talk about this morning. Wellbeing and workload, connecting to purpose and wider society, workplace culture and how we sustain that, and navigating change and uncertainty. So turning first of all to well-being, it feels that leaders now, and indeed in the future, will need to be so much more emotionally engaged with their teams. We've seen the importance, particularly at the start of lockdown, of people checking in with one another, being really kind and flexible in terms of acknowledging the challenges of combining homeschooling, caring responsibilities, illness, all the things that we know about with working. But I'm noticing, and I don't know what it's like for other people, but I'm noticing that this has begun to shift a bit, certainly with work ramping up in recent weeks and people starting to feel much more overwhelmed. And perhaps the checking in that really characterised those early weeks seems to be disappearing a little. I'm hearing as well that people are feeling very tired, sitting in front of Zoom calls all day, having tons of work to get through, and many not having taken leave in recent months. People have moved mountains in recent weeks, making changes that ordinarily would have taken years to achieve. And I think where adrenaline and a really can-do spirit characterised those first couple of months, now tiredness and fatigue are setting in. Many organisations have moved really rapidly to ramping up the support that they're offering to their teams, pulling together a package of support that addresses those strains and anxieties that people have been feeling. But looking beyond the current situation, I believe from what I've seen that our leaders in the future will need to be able to connect much more authentically to support and care for their employees and their teams. People will want and expect their leaders to care about them and what they're going through. A survey, I think, from the Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development back in March, before I think the pandemic, showed that only a third of HR professionals in the public sector felt that senior leaders were encouraging a focus on well-being. We were already seeing, I think, before the pandemic, people feeling much more concerned about their overall work-life balance, and this has only been exacerbated by COVID. The days of having an employee assistance programme and occupational health schemes, though important, will not, I don't think, in the future be considered enough by employees. They'll be looking for something much more rounded, perhaps a combination of things like coaching, Zumba, Pilates, running, cycling, all the things that we've heard people talk about that have helped them get through recent months, combined with some specific support about particular needs that people may have, whether that's caring responsibilities, menopause friendly approaches, or mental health support. Again, some of that's been there for a while in some employers, but I think smart employers will start to put a package together that really speaks to people's broader life needs. And beyond that, I think leaders and managers will need much more confidence and skills in having those broader conversations with people, and will need to have a broader access to different tools than they have at the moment. And fundamentally, leaders will need to see it as part of their role as helping to support their teams to lead the happiest, healthiest lives that they can. And they'll need to show their active support and care for their teams. One of the chief execs that I spoke to in the early weeks said that she realised that she loved her team. She came to realise that in the first few weeks of lockdown, and I was really struck by that. Now, I'm not suggesting that all chief execs need to love their teams exactly, but I do think there's an increasing expectation that leaders show authentic care and attention for their teams. They'll want their place of work to be a place filled with, I think, hope and kindness. Some leaders will be naturally good at this and people will turn to them for help and support, but it won't be enough that the naturally caring leaders do this. It can't just be the burden of the ones that find it that naturally do this to show their care and attention. It'll be essential for all leaders to commit to developing those softer skills. So the second issue I wanted to focus on was wider purpose. And I think that leaders in the future will need to be much more attuned to the wider societal landscape. Issues around inequality, diversity and inclusion, environmental sustainability have rightly leapt to the top of issues that we're all concerned about. And I think that good leaders will have to take a position on these issues in the future. Leaders will just need to be constantly scanning the external environment and making sense of what it will mean for them and their wider organisation. I think it'll be important for leaders not to outsource responsibility for these areas, not to outsource responsibility for increasing diversity of the workforce to their HR team or to a recruitment agency, but for leaders at the top of organisations to own it, to model it, and to actively tackle it. In the Southwest, I think we've largely failed to make diversity and inclusion a serious topic, but that won't be acceptable any longer, I don't think. We'll need, as leaders and managers, to be absolutely clear and committed to diversifying our workplaces. And we'll need leaders to create safe spaces within organisations to have those discussions and navigate those challenging topics. I think to create space beyond the immediacy of the issues of the business and to connect outwards and forwards within your communities. Not everyone wants to face up to these issues, but it will be critical that the leader puts them front and centre. So for me, I think there's something about the way in which leaders connect with the contemporary issues that will emerge even more forcefully as a result of COVID, issues around inequality, poverty, supporting communities who will be at risk of falling behind, around young people and the support that they'll need to gain a foothold in employment. Lots of the leaders that I've spoken to have been really struck by some of these issues, in particular by digital inequality during lockdown, the realisation that people, particularly young people, just simply don't have access to laptops, Wi-Fi's and the skills to use them. That's a campaign that I can really see people getting behind. I've heard it discussion about food inequality too really strike home with some of our region's leaders. The realisation that for many young people, their only decent meal of the day was at school or college. I think we'll want our leaders to take a stand on these issues and to be clear about how their businesses and organisations can play a part, but also how they involve us as employees in enlisting employees in shaping new campaigns and programmes that mean that you can really actively get behind and support a cause or issue that's important to your organisation or your company. For me, this isn't about corporate social responsibility, but a genuine commitment on the part of today's and tomorrow's leaders to make our society better. The third issue I want to talk about, going through these quite quickly, third issue is a workplace culture. So leaders' role in establishing and maintaining workplace culture has always been important, but I think it will become both harder and easier in the future. Leaders will just constantly need to assert the purpose and mission of their business and their organisation and the impact that it can have on communities, on employees, on wider society. I think it'll become easier in some ways because the means to open up communication across the workforce has suddenly become much easier. At Tate, where I've been doing some work recently in London, the chief executive has been hosting regular staff briefings attended by over 700 staff. Now, previously, she wouldn't have been able to see more than 100 people physically in one space. At the university, the Vice-Chancellor has been regularly doing webinars for staff to live audiences of over 2,000 members of staff. And I'm sure many of you have been exposed to much more regular contact from your chief execs and senior team than you would have had previously. So there's much greater opportunity to hear directly from your chief exec and to get a clear sense of where they stand on certain issues. But it does require the chief exec to be effective in connecting emotionally and transparently with people by a largely one-way video connection. So it'll be absolutely essential that the chief exec continues to assert that mission and that vision, as I've said, to reassure staff that the work that they do has real meaning and value, and to find a way to balance realism about the impact of an organisation's financial position with a sense of hope and positivity. The chief exec has a really powerful role to play in creating that connection between employees and their culture, which, if done well, can nurture a really strong sense of workplace culture. But it becomes much harder to maintain workplace culture in this new environment too. People will continue to work from home, I think, in large numbers. All the evidence suggests that people will spend at least part of their week at home. Some people may find themselves back in the office full time, others working largely from home. And the leader will need to work hard, I think, to make sure that everyone feels equally involved and included. Much of it will come down to empowering and enabling staff at all levels, to creating that sort of strong values-based framework where it's not so much kind of being there 9 to 5, but about the difference and impact that you can make, the contribution you can make to your organisation, to build that culture that engages and trusts people to take forward work within a broader strategic framework. What's been so fascinating and so inspiring, I think, is to see how much leadership has emerged from new and unexpected places in recent months. And we'll definitely need to find ways to nurture and cultivate that leadership, making sure that hierarchies don't reassert themselves in ways that will be really disempowering to those very people that have worked so hard in recent weeks to find workarounds and to deliver real impact for us. And my final theme is around navigating change and uncertainty. There's no doubt that there will be huge changes in the way that businesses and organisations are structured going forward. Financial challenges will result, I think, in many different outcomes. For some, their businesses will become unsustainable. Others will need to adapt new business models. Some will expand potentially or merge with other organisations. Leaders will be expected by their board, by their stakeholders, shareholders, to maximise the potential for automating aspects of their work. And in some industries, this is very standard. but I think it will now sprint forward in sectors that haven't yet been automated. So how will our leaders navigate this shift? And how ultimately will they lead part automated, part human teams? That will become a major leadership challenge, I think, for many. And in an uncertain environment, how can leaders create conditions that enable people to innovate, to experiment and take risks? During lockdown, there was such a spirit of innovation and just getting things done. But with the understandable rush to reopen facilities and get the economy back up and running, I think there's a real risk of returning to business as usual. So how do we as leaders protect the space for innovation and experimentation to help make sure our organisations are well protected for future shocks? What does all of this mean? I'm just going to have a look. What can our leaders and managers, what can we all do now to prepare us well and to support our colleagues? I think it's really important for our leaders to keep checking in with their teams, to kind of reassert the things that they were doing so well in those early weeks. Encourage people to take annual leave. I know it's going to be a very tricky period the next couple of months. Everybody's got leave to take, but I think it's just so important before the autumn that people have the chance to feel refreshed and re-energized. I think it's really important for leaders to role model well-being, to make sure that, you know, as leaders, we're all taking breaks, making sure that we don't work unsociable hours, not allowing meetings to creep into unsociable times, you know, to just being very conscious all of the messages that sends out to our staff if we don't role model good well-being. I think it's really helpful to encourage teams, organisations to reflect on what's worked well during lockdown. What are the things that you want to hold on to? How can you become a more flexible environment? How can you make sure that you've got an inclusive return to work? How do you make sure that those people that need to be working from home don't feel disadvantaged by the return to work? I think going back to diversity and inclusion, it's just so important over the summer that people take the time to educate themselves. That's what I'll be doing over the summer, reading so much more on diversity and inclusion, making sure that I'm as informed as I possibly can be. I think thinking about that leadership talent that has emerged in recent weeks, how are we going to support and nurture that talent? And as I said before, resist that complete return to business as usual, just spot where the innovation is. So in summary, and I don't know how well I'm doing for time, Sally, but in summary, I think that the leadership of the future will be, I mean, in many ways, it will be similar to it was before, but I think bringing that experience from the pandemic, we will be looking for leaders who are open to new possibilities, new ways of working, new ways of sharing information that is really open and transparent. We'll be looking for leaders who are adaptive, constantly changing their approach in the light of the changing environment, the wider society. Leaders that are genuinely kind and caring and attuned to their employees' needs. Decisive and tough enough when they need to be, taking those hard decisions, but in that building a spirit and empowering leadership at all different levels, finding ways to co-create new solutions with staff groups, giving as much control to employees about shaping their own working patterns and approaches, and underpinning it all, encouraging a spirit of innovation and experimentation. As I say, at the business school, we're really keen to connect with leaders and organisations and to connect you all within our areas of research, our academics and researchers who are beginning to research all of this stuff around COVID. So do please get in touch. I think I've put my email address at the bottom. We've got some really good resources that I can share, some good reading around all of this, if that would be helpful, and, you know, really keen to keep in touch with people. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you very much indeed. I think it's quite exhausting looking at that and thinking about what we've all just been through and thinking how we've still got to up our game further. And I think that's a big challenge. Just invite everybody attending this to put questions into the question and answer tab. We've got one from Alan, who says the current economic environment will place a lot of focus on reducing cost, driving value and competing efficiently. How do you see the leadership priorities in this environment?
Yeah, I think it's a really tough one, and I think it goes back. Some of it goes back to this thing around being open and transparent. I think it's a real trick to pull off, to be as open with employees about the financial position of individual organisations and what that might mean for them. And I think, just being upfront about that and giving people the chance to think about their own position, so that they can start to prepare themselves. And that might be about reskilling, it might be looking for work elsewhere, it might be preparing for an interview within the job in a new structure. All of that, I think, will be very important, and for employers and CEOs to give people signposts to say, this is what it could be like, this is what you might want to be thinking about. But it's for sure it's not easy, and how that squares with a leadership style that has been very different in the past. I think it's a time for leaders to adapt and to change, and not easy at all.
Ciara, so one of the unusual things for a lot of companies, some of them will have furloughed all or some of their workforce. Some of them will have teams that have pressed through regardless. What are your thoughts about bringing the furloughed and the continuing workers back together? Because that has to be one of the most difficult things when there have been large numbers of people who have worked extremely long hours, and yet at another level, there are some that have really, in some ways, been missing out.
Yeah. And certainly hearing anecdotally that there in some places that has built resentment. People that have been working flat out, and then people that seemingly have been at home furloughed. And I think treating people exactly the same, because I think actually people that have been furloughed have been incredibly helpful to their organisations, because in many cases that those staff working, being furloughed has saved their organisations. So actually they have made a contribution. So for me, I think it's about acknowledging that each of those groups have equally contributed to those organisations in ways that are important for the sustainability of those organisations. I think bringing back staff that have been furloughed, and it's now been quite a period of time, requires real thought and care, because people have been out of the workplace. How do you bring them back? How do you, some of that is about preparing good quality resources. And I've certainly seen organisations produce really thoughtful resources about coming back to work safely, what this means, what you need to be thinking about. And then I think there's an awful lot of stuff that sort of sits under the surface that's about informal contact between teams. And I think organisations that have managed to sustain, yes, the formal stuff about the meetings, but also found ways through Zoom, through Teams, whatever it is, to create that sense of connection. And I think the more that you can do those informal things that bring groups of people back together as a single team and start to get people looking ahead, that's going to be really helpful. People want to connect with their colleagues. They'll have missed their colleagues. They want to come back together and get on, with seeing their organisations move forward.
That's great. So again, we're open for questions. You've talked an awful lot about how I think the leaders themselves need to be transformed as they move forward, and I wonder whether you could talk a bit about coaching and leaders, and how we can make that transformation, because it's going to require a bit of time, I think, and quite a lot of effort.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally what's been interesting to see, at the business school, we've brought some chief execs together, as you know, Sally, for some roundtable sessions. And I think what's been interesting about that is that people are clamouring to talk and to share. There's a sense of having been through this extraordinary time, and actually people just about coming up for air, and actually wanting to connect with their colleagues, wanting to find how it's been for other people. So I think generally, when I talk about all of this in terms of what leaders will need to do, at the heart of it, a lot of it, I think, is about being open and about reflecting and saying to teams, how's it been for you? How have I been? How could I be better? what more could we do together? So although it might sound very different, I think it's about acknowledging we're all human. We've been through this experience, and how do we reflect and learn as a team? And I think there's some really simple things that leaders could do. In terms of coaching, I think that just having a safe space for leaders who have been trying to get their organisations through this period, often in, at times of incredible pressure, talking to NHS colleagues or talking to police colleagues, you have this sense of what an intense period it's been. So I think coaching is a very helpful kind of safe space, a confidential space for leaders and people at all different levels within organisations to kind of unpick what they've been experiencing, but also look forward. I mean, coaching is very future orientated. It's about what do you want to achieve in the short, medium and long term. And I think it just creates a bit of space for people to take space. And some people will have been through these last few months and think, actually, the future for me is something very different from what I thought it was going to be. Actually, I think actually I'd quite like to be retired now. I hadn't thought that before, but actually now is the time to really set up this new organisation or this new business that I've been thinking about for so long. And coaching can be a very helpful way to think through new possibilities of what your life might look like in the future.
Yeah, it's funny. You're already talking about retirement. In fact, one of my old friends has literally retired in the last week from the University of Nottingham. And it's quite a shock to everybody else when that happens, I think. Not least because I think we suddenly think, God, it could have been me, which is a bit of a shock. So we've got Andrew Finley from Oxford Innovation. Question from him: given the importance of team building activity through formal and informal gatherings pre-COVID, what are your thoughts on how the sense of team spirit can be engendered in the new environment we find ourselves in?
That's such a good question. I'd love to know what Andrew's thoughts were on that. I think we will begin to see that sort of autumn sense of kind of team away days. I've already started to chat with people about this concept of an away day when you're all still physically from home. And certainly I've facilitated a few things recently where people, you just can't sustain that, the shorter, sharper, more focused things. I think it goes in terms of the team building stuff, it's really critical. And it plays to that sort of informal, how do you bring people together? Who are the people in your team that kind of have a sense of fun, I think, that can kind of do quizzes or things that kind of get people together? I've seen some great stuff on Teams where people are just keeping in touch with their colleagues with fun stuff. But some of this will be about learning more about each other. Maybe it goes back to that sort of reflective piece around what do we know now about each other that we didn't know before, both good and bad. Where are the sort of some of the 360-degree sort of mechanisms, so that we can really deeply understand better how we need to work in this new environment and how we get along with our colleagues. So I think it is a time, in a weird sort of way, to take stock of teams. I've been doing a project with a particular team and really encouraging them to just pause, think about their own behaviours. They're set for some real challenges ahead. So actually doing some work now as a team together to put themselves in the strongest position is counterintuitive because they've got a massive change agenda, but actually just to pause and do some work together, bring in a facilitator, do some work around how you perceive each other, where your own strengths and weaknesses lie, and reconstitute yourself effectively as a team that's fit for the future. And I think there's a lot to be said for, the summer period being a period for a bit of personal reflection, and maybe something in the early autumn as teams start to think about, right, here's where we're going, to spend some time together as a team.
Yeah, one of the things we did fairly early on was got everybody to contribute to a team-wide pestle analysis of where we were going. And everybody had to produce 2 examples of each. And then we typed them all out, we got them together and we talked through them. Mm. And at the time, so one of my colleagues said that a lot of what she was hearing was from the continuous BBC newsreel, which was super doom and gloom. Whereas actually there were some good news stories out there, and there were trends that could be positive, and it also gave people a chance to buy into the future much more.
Mm-hmm. I think things like that, those sort of collaborative exercises that you can do together as a team, just bond people, you know, where they're meaningful and they really make a difference there, and where you can bring everybody's different perspectives to bear. Very powerful way of connecting teams. I think you're right, Sally.
Great. Any more questions from attendees? Perhaps not. So, well, I will take away from this that probably I need to keep work between 9 and 5 or 8:30 and 5. I'm not going to guarantee that that's going to happen, but I will guarantee to go out and play tennis twice a week and perhaps walk on Dartmoor, which is my home, at least 1 or 2 times a week. I think the leave thing is really critically important. We're seeing lots of tired people, and trying to give people time off in a kind of staggered manner as we ourselves open up on the 3rd of August. We've got quite a big push, and then I think we're going to have a period of holding back and just trying to guide our colleagues and our tenants through the process. Thank you. Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. Ciara, thank you so much for giving this talk.
You're welcome.
I think leadership is such an important part of growing companies, and much appreciated. Thank you very much. So
very welcome, and do feel free to anybody to contact me. You know, as I say, the business school, we're really keen to help support and connect with our local businesses and organisations. So do feel free to contact me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Okay. Goodbye.
All right.